are, and the time comes for our secret speaker. Are you ready? Here it comes. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you. Wait, just put here. No, just be sure that I have everything. So he's the inventor and the co-creator, one of the fathers of Scrum. Has worked with thousands of companies deploying Scrum and recently launched 2 global trainer programs for Scrum Inc., Scrum trainers and certified Scrum at Scale trainers, in addition to creating 2 independent companies, Scrum in Japan and Scrum Scale LLC. In 2006, working as senior advisor to OpenView Venture Partners and their portfolio companies, he established his own company. Scrum Inc. is now recognized as the premier source of Scrum training in the world. His latest book, Scrum, The Art of Doing Twice of the Work in the Half of Time, describes how he used his background and experience to create the most widely used Agile practice in the industry today. Ladies and gentlemen, Sutherland is our special guest.
Hugo, thanks for inviting me today. Hugo asked me to share for a few minutes what I've been doing, what's been going on. I want to talk about Scrum and Scrum at Scale. So hopefully you can see my screen. There's been a Twitter storm about where Scrum comes from, and it has a very long history. It goes all the way back to my time at West Point when I joined there as a cadet. The Olympic team for gymnastics.
It was okay?
Is it okay, Hugo? When I was joined West Point as a cadet, the Olympic team for gymnastics was working out there. I joined the West Point gymnastics team and was trained with the Olympic team for several years. And I learned the importance of continuous improvement, and it enabled me to build some championship teams, both sports teams, but also marching teams on the parade field by making work visible in color-coded notes about what needed to be done. So I learned about making work visible to cause teams to self-organize. This kind of thinking translated many years later when I came into the commercial sector to using my military experience in the Air Force to use a burn down chart to land a project just like we land a fighter aircraft on an aircraft carrier. A lot of the thinking behind the military leaders, Sun Tzu, The Art of War, training people how to win a war without firing a shot, is needed by Agile coaches. Musashi, who taught the way of 2 swords, the short sword and the long sword, is built into Scrum with the sprint goal adding up to the big goal for the product vision. And we're upgrading the Scrum Guide right now to emphasize the sprint goal and the goal as first-class artifacts in the Scrum Guide. I was taught about the fog of war by General von Clausewitz, how as soon as you start to engage, bad things happen, things get confusing. And how to get out of that, I was taught by the world's greatest fighter pilot, Colonel John Boyd, and his OODA loop. As soon as you engage, the opposing forces will appear. And then you need to change your direction and come in at a different angle to disrupt the opposing forces. And then as the opposing forces move to counteract, you need to execute that OODA loop again. Professor Nonaka, who wrote the first paper talking about Scrum project management, is now writing a book on the US Marines. And he says the OODA loop, which is the strategy for the Marines, is more important to Toyota than the PDCA cycle today, because the need for change, the need for speed, the need for innovation that we've been talking about, particularly in the hardware sector, needs the OODA loop. The theory behind Scrum, though, comes from my medical training. I spent 11 years as a fighter pilot, then my last tour at the Air Force Academy. Then I'm pulled into the medical school, the University of Colorado Medical School, because I wanted to complete a PhD. That was right near the Air Force Academy. And there I did supercomputer research on the human cell. And by understanding how cells evolve and change, particularly in the field of cancer, what causes that, we learned about complex adaptive systems, how they work, how small steps move a system through a design space. And a team is this complex adaptive system, just like a cell. And the way to operationalize that, I learned from robotics. I helped incubate a company called iRobot back in the 80s. And these robots are autonomous robots with no database. They only have sensors. Professor Brooks showed me how they work. When they start, they have a neural network chip with no information on it. They learn how to walk in less than 5 minutes. And the simple rules that they execute are built into Scrum. The way the first Scrum team envisioned this is, you're going to change a system. You want to ask, what's the smallest step we can take today that will push the system towards a greater capability? We want to run that system, then we want to make the next change. And doing it that way will give you systems 10 times faster with 10 times the quality. So all of this thinking in supercomputing research, cancer research, robotics, all of that is baked into Scrum. Now, recently I was asked to meet with Akihito Fuji in Boston. He's the general manager of cloud services for KDDI, which is one of the biggest companies in Japan. It's 20% owned by Toyota. And he came to me in Boston and he said, we want the true Scrum, the Scrum of the grandfathers in Japan. By that, he meant the Scrum that Takeuchi and Naka are talking about in the new product development game paper, where we took the name Scrum. And he said, our investors want Agile Scrum. It needs to be different than what's being trained. It needs to be a lean Scrum. It needs to be a high-performing Scrum. It needs to scale to hundreds and thousands of teams. And we want to form a joint venture with Scrum Inc. to bring that training to Japan. And it took us a couple of years to working together before we formed that joint venture. Some reason I've lost my screen here. Just a second, see if I get it back. There we go. So, in addition to Scrum and the Scrum Guide, the implementation of Scrum needs to be lean. That's what Takeuchi and Naka were talking about. And we have some good papers about Scrum in that domain, because Systematic, a lean company in Japan, or not in Japan, but in Denmark, has published several different papers going through how they first double velocity of teams by getting a strong definition of done, and then by getting a strong definition of ready, doubling it again. So that's how they get twice the work in half the time. When we met with the Lean Enterprise Institute, they showed us this book, Lean Product and Process Development. And they said, that is what Takeuchi and Naka are talking about. And in there, the Scrum of Nonaka is defined. And so your Scrum needs to look like that if it's going to work at Toyota. And at Toyota, a recent book by Takeo Sakai, he sent me an email. He said, Jeff, you're not teaching Scrum right. You need to clarify that 95% of the profits are generated by the chief engineers at Toyota, and they do it by designing a backlog with very high value, and they have to deliver it at very low cost. So twice the value at half the cost is what made Toyota a great company and made it more profitable per car than most of the other auto manufacturers. So this needs to be built into the way you approach Scrum. The second thing, after 10 to 15 years working with venture capital groups, they are interested in very fast, high-performing teams. And they asked me to write down specifically how to get there because, frankly, most Scrum teams, the data clearly show, are not high-performing. So in order to get them there, I've worked with the Scrum Patterns group for over a decade to produce. The book was published last fall. And a particular interest to me in that book are a set of patterns that generate high-productive teams. And we've written a paper on that, which is in the IEEE library. You can also download it at the Scrum Inc. site for free. And it goes through the key sets of patterns that they're not optional if you want high performance. So we have to introduce training and patterns into the Scrum community. And finally, if we need to scale to hundreds or thousands of teams, Scrum at Scale, Joe mentions it's hierarchical in certain the way the diagrams are hierarchical, but Scrum at Scale is based on the biggest Scrum implementations of the world. Amazon, Microsoft, even in Apple, they tell me they do Scrum by the book, and they mean the Scrum book that I wrote. SAP and so forth. Amazon is interesting because it is not a very hierarchical Scrum. The teams are attempted to be almost totally autonomous by being microservices teams. So Scrum at Scale can be implemented with more or less hierarchy. But the major thing is at scale, you have to prioritize everything. You have to deliver at a rapid pace as being talked about here. And you have to change the organization to enable that delivery. So two absolutely core principles in Scrum at Scale. Every company we go in, if we prioritize everything, we find out the bottom 30% of the organizational backlog is stuff that shouldn't be done. For example, an IT services group prioritizes everything they're doing, and then they find out the bottom 30% is Windows 7 support. Most everybody's gone to Windows 10. They cut Windows 7 support, and in one day they free up 300 people. We've seen that at GE, we've seen it at 3M, we've seen it at Toyota. We even see it in a restaurant in London that's using Scrum. When they got the teams together to build the shifts, they found a third of the shifts were not needed. The managers were creating 33% of the shifts that were not needed. So we need to stop doing that stuff. And the leadership has to see the backlog of the organization. Once we have that removed, we know from decades of data from the Standards Group that 2/3 of the stories that are implemented are never or rarely used by the customers. So the product owners need to stop building that stuff. So with a proper focus on this, we can free up half the people very quickly to focus on the top priority things the customer will use. The other key concept is decision latency. The Standards Group spent the last several years trying to figure out why does Scrum work? And what they discovered in their database of over 500,000 projects is that if decision time averages less than an hour, the success rate is 58%. And if it averages more than 5 hours, it's 18%. And this difference is bigger than the difference between waterfall and Agile, okay? So Agile is not going to do you any good unless you get that decision latency down under an hour. So that means decisions need to be pushed down to the team. Product owners need to be right there to make priority decisions quickly. And management needs to be meeting every day and removing blocks and impediment from the organization. And these and other key concepts are fundamental to Scrum at Scale. So what we've been doing is training a lot of people all over the world, including one of our favorite Scrum at Scale trainers.
Hi, I'm Hugo, and I'm here with Dr. Jeff Sutherland, the creator of Scrum and Scrum at Scale. So, Jeff, about Scrum at Scale, how are things?
Well, Scrum at Scale is great, and everybody in Portugal that's doing Scrum should get trained at Scrum at Scale. It significantly improves the operations and the performance of the organization. And Hugo is our Scrum at Scale trainer in Portugal.
Okay, so Hugo, that's my shout out for you today. And I think I kept it under 15 minutes as you requested. So back to you, Hugo.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you so much. Appreciate it for being here today. It's so much food for the brain once again. Guys, just want to, my big thank you to Jeff, because he teach me so many things, but so many things. And not just teaching. When we start this with, in 2014-15, when we start with these conferences, Jeff was there. Jeff was the first one that said, I want to support that. I want to support the communities, and I want them to do Scrum in the right way. So it was really an honor that I have Jeff and that day here there with us. Also Thomas Friend, he was there, U.S. military pilot. And it was, since then, it was always learning. I also become a Scrum at Scale trainer right there in Boston with Jeff in the same room. And we travel in several places, and there we were in Washington taking this video to the communities and to Portugal companies that wants to improve their way of working and delivery and improve their business outcomes to their customers. So this was Jeff, and now thank you so much once again. It was really enlightening. And right now I'll leave you with all the workshops that are right now opening, and some of them are already running perhaps, but here they are. And you can always follow that in experienceagile.com.